Okay, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I express my sincere gratitude to the Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Public Policy and its Dean, Dr. Wang Tat, for the valuable opportunity of organizing this panel. The pandemic and a completely new reality it generated are placing increased demands on the quality of governance, which plays a crucial role in both immediate responses to the new challenges and in the search for adequate recovery measures. Undoubtedly, this is accompanied by reconsideration of all government activities, from the reallocation of resources and functions and the application of best management practices to the accelerated use of information technologies and communication strategies. At the same time, the key condition for the effective implementation of government decisions is public trust, which is not only a social value per se, but also effective administrative capital, instilling confidence in rationality of government strategies. Therefore, increasing or restoring public trust is also a challenge of a new reality for governments. In this regard, along with ensuring the timeliness and relevance of decisions made, it's important to retain legitimacy, accountability, and transparency of all decision-making and resource allocation process. Today, we observe that countries around the globe are accumulating unique experience in a new normal. Thus, in a quarantined environment, the exchange of best practices and partnership are gaining ever greater significance. Bearing them in mind and in line with its mission, the Astana Hub has launched the Virtual Alliance of Practitioners for Experience Sharing in the context of COVID-19. Today, 10 countries and about 20 organizations have shared their experience, research, and innovative solutions, which are available to everyone on the website of the Hub. Besides that, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have organized 20 capacity building events in which over 3,200 civil servants from 46 countries have taken part. Let me take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to all the participating countries and partner organizations for their earnest commitment to cooperation. I'd like to extend my deep appreciation to the Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan for Civil Service Affairs and personally to Ms. Anarja Ilganova for our fruitful collaboration and their constant support of all initiatives. Also, I'd like to thank the key implementing partner of the government of Kazakhstan, the UNDP country office, and personally Mr. Yakub Berish for their willingness and flexibility in the implementation of Hub's mission. Dear colleagues, today we are blessed to have a brilliant composition of speakers who will allow us to look at governance in a new normal from different angles and based on various national and international experiences while combining practical and academic points of view. This makes me certain that our united efforts will greatly contribute to the search for best fit solutions. Wishing you and your loved ones good health and prosperity to your home countries. Thank you. And now I'd like to give the floor to the Vice Dean for Research of the GSPP, Chair of today's conference, Dr. Ricardo Pilizzo, who kindly accepted the role of the moderator today. Thank you, and please, Ricardo, floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here as a moderator on this distinguished panel. Let me give the floor to Anara Jailganova, chairperson of the Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan for Civil Service, because she is supposed to give a few words of welcome as well. if she's here.
Спасибо большое, уважаемые. Уважаемые участники, коллеги, я искренне рада приветствовать вас сегодня на панельной сессии, онлайн-сессии, посвященной управлению и доверию в период пандемии COVID-19. Позвольте в первую очередь выразить благодарность нашим партнерам, Астанинскому хабу государственной службы и Высшей школе государственной политики Назарбаев университета за организацию данного мероприятия, проведение которого сегодня как никогда актуально и необходимо. Как отметил наш президент Касым-Жомарт Кемелевич Токаев, пандемия стала стресс-тестом для всех государств. Однако мы, как и многие другие страны, смогли мобилизоваться и перестроить свою работу с учетом полученного опыта. Принят ряд мер по обеспечению социально-экономической стабильности и поддержки населения. На эти цели было направлено более 450 миллиардов тенге по инициативе Ельбасы, первого президента Нурсултана Абишевича Назарбаева. Единовременной финансовой поддержкой фонда «Бергемес» охвачено более 550 тысяч семей. Для обеспечения бесперебойного функционирования госаппарата и сохранения здоровья персонала мы сумели в крайне сжатые сроки организовать дистанционную работу 80% государственных служащих. Согласно проведенному совместно со Всемирным банком опросу казахстанских госслужащих, переход на дистанционный формат не оказал влияния на эффективность их работы. Кроме того, принимаются меры по ускоренной цифровизации государственного аппарата, оптимизации его функций, пересмотру системы госпланирования и нормотворчества и так далее. Вместе с тем, нынешний кризис также показал, что эффективное государственное управление и коммуникации являются ключевыми элементами успеха антикризисных мер. В данном контексте надеюсь, что данная конференция сегодняшняя будет полезной для политиков, также экспертов в странах региона и за его пределами. Уважаемые участники, желаю всем плодотворной работы, приобретения новых знаний и расширения возможностей. Благодарю всех за внимание.
The floor is now of Jakub Beris, UNDP resident representative in the Republic of Kazakhstan. Mr. Beris.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure to address this audience today. I would like to begin my words by thanking Chairman Baymenov, Chairman of Steering Committee for Astana Civil Service Hub, for co-organizing this important event and for the kind invitation. I'm also pleased to welcome Her Excellency Chairwoman of the Civil Service Agency, Ms. Anar Zhelgonova. And just a couple of days ago, we had a great meeting with her, which was a testimony to how much we have in common and how much potential we have to expand our already solid partnership. We are all going through tough times. The COVID-19 pandemic gave rise to an unprecedented healthcare crisis, which quickly translated into a large-scale socioeconomic crisis, endangering the effective implementation of the development agenda, both at the national and international levels. Not only is the COVID-19 a challenge for implementation of 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, but it also threatens to reverse the progress attained in the preceding decades on all three fronts of sustainable development: social, economic, as well as environmental. This March, Kazakhstan faced a dual challenge. The spread of coronavirus was complicated by a dramatic fall in the price of oil, which is a key source for internal revenue. These two factors combined created a high-risk environment, triggering an economic downturn and resulting in a decline in real income of the country's population. For us, COVID-19 exposed pre-existing inequalities as it hit vulnerable groups disproportionately with the combined effect of the related restrictive measures. Women, people with disabilities, unemployed, and self-employed were among the most affected. The crisis puts multiple pressures on the governments across the world. It's not Kazakhstan specific, exposing gaps and weaknesses. The governments are expected to quickly analyze dynamically changing development situation, mobilize resources, and readjust policies and programs to provide effective support, first of all, to those that were most hit by the crisis. In this respect, and in many other respects too, of course, public trust is fundamental, as the success of many policies depend on the behavioral responses of the population. As UNDP, we were next to the government when the pandemic hit the country and mobilized financial as well as technical resources in a short period of time to put at the disposal of the country. Our support included, among other things, assessing the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable groups, providing temporary jobs for the young people who were temporarily unemployed because of the COVID-19 crisis, assisting the civil service with digitalization on human resource management functions, and supporting reskilling of 1,000 civil servants to effectively perform their duties in teleworking mode, and of course, among others, procuring autoclaves in Nur Sultan while assisting in developing stronger medical waste management systems and procuring ambulances for remote settlements. Dear colleagues, in the past months, understandably, the focus of the government was on the immediate crisis response and recovery, but it also is now the time to think about the mid and long-term challenges and development priorities, about how we can build back better and greener. This cannot be achieved without strong governance systems in place. Any such governance systems are tested by the complexity and uncertainty that a future-oriented development perspective brings. Navigating in those uncharted waters would only be possible by the compass guided by public trust, something that makes me appreciate the topic of this panel. And I wish you all have a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barris, for your words. We are going to proceed now with the 8 presentations that are scheduled to take place in this panel. Before we do so, I have some instructions to provide. Those of you who want to ask questions can do so in the chat feature that is at the bottom of our screen. Please indicate your organization and the country where you're from, and of course, the question that you have. The list of the speaker is as indicated in the program. It is Catherine Cardava, Fadi Farah, Vitalis Nakrosis, Dr. Light, Christine Leitner, Karin Badr, Rupinder Singh, Paul Reynolds, and Muhammad Ali Khudaverdiev. So we will go in the order as scheduled, and each of the speakers has 10 minutes. We have 8 presentations that will take us to 3:30. 4:30, and they will give us 30 minutes for the question and answer. Thank you very much.
So, hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will share my presentation. Okay. So, So, I am Katerina Cardava, Head of Civil Service Bureau of Georgia. It is my absolute pleasure to be a part of this very important meeting. I would like to take this chance and express my sincere appreciation to all of you who contributed to make this event happen. We all experience an unprecedented situation, and the novel challenges that we are facing are unique in the current climate at a global level, and effective public management that deserves public trust is more important even before. So, with my presentation, I would like to share Georgia's experience focusing on the impacts and effects of the pandemic on governance and present insight of the ongoing processes and measures undertaken within the civil service and in the country generally in response to the recent developments. I will also provide an overview of the new experience in successfully adjusting to teleworking, applying unified approaches toward crisis management, and identifying key factors in enhancing the capacity of civil service to cope with the challenges. Before the pandemic, Georgian civil service had a decentralized approach towards teleworking, and only several public institutions were using it as a form of performing tasks. Remote work pattern, which had been an opportunity and a free choice so far, had become a prerequisite for the continuation of activities in general. However, in the public sector, where flexible forms of work are not so easy to implement, this was a fairly new solution. Thus, in the beginning of the pandemic, Georgian civil service was not well prepared to fully transferring to remote work, as it implies unique challenges that require maintaining work-life balance and refraining professional isolation while being socially distant. In addition to the lack of telework experience in civil service, transition to even more challenging as there was not a legal framework that would regulate the kind of work arrangement. Consequently, it has been prioritized to ensure that the needs of civil servants are identified and they are communicated with in ways that meet their needs. As things seem today, adapting to the new work from home environment becomes successful in Georgia due to high degree of adaptability and willingness of civil servants. Furthermore, it was clearly prioritized that for supporting the transition to more widespread remote work, creating a legal basis was necessary. And to this end, Civil Service Bureau of Georgia elaborated the rule of remote work in Civil Service Bureau, and this served as a guideline for all public institutions. Additionally, it has been improved that collaborative approach is crucial when it comes to dealing with complex challenges and problems. Learning from successful practices stands for improvement in finding better solutions to crises. Thus, by sharing our experiences and ideas, even in virtual format, we feel less isolated and we can actually deal with common shortcomings and act decisively innovatively. In this regard, within the Twinning project, Lithuanian experts shared their experience on teleworking and prepared guidelines on remote work in civil service based on the best global practice, and it was distributed within all public institutions. And there has been an increasing interest from private sector as well. As this guideline is bilingual, it would be my pleasure to share it with you if you can become interested in it. Today, when civil service is encouraged to cope with ever-changing environment, civil servants have a critical role in strengthening the effectiveness and responsiveness of civil service and maintain public trust. In this respect, professional development of civil servants remain to be at the top priority, and for increasing the capacity of civil servants, trainings, workshops, and civil servant forums are conducted remotely in a regular way during the whole period of pandemic. The Civil Servants Forum was used as an important tool to serve as a communication platform, bringing civil servants together to discuss emerging issues, share best practices, and develop a common vision for future development. The topic of each forum was devoted to the urgent and timely issues during pandemic, such as crisis management, work-life balance, and so on. Through regular forum meetings, the government of Georgia ensured to have a good communication system in place that offered high level of support to civil servants working from home. In this regard, the above-mentioned forum platform was used for regular discussions on how innovation can help civil servants to cope with the crisis and set a new agenda for the future. In addition, the Civil Service Bureau currently is doing a research in two very important topics. First, teleworking practices in Georgia during pandemic, and second, risk management of human resources. In order to minimize damage as a result of the pandemic, since April, government of Georgia has been moving to easy restriction on citizens and businesses and elaborated respective plan for reopening. The reopening plan constitutes 6 different phases. Each stage takes place in every 2 weeks while taking into consideration the epidemiological situation in the country. So to sum up, governments across the world have been tasked with responding rapidly, efficiently, and coherently to a series of challenges. Lessons learned from Georgia's experience, adaptation to new technological solutions, and regular refinement ensures that the public sector can operate effectively during the crisis. It is important to mention that this experience of Georgia was particularly successful due to the fact that since 2004, Georgia is being integrated into an e-governance system, and thus the shift to remote work become easier. Finally, some of the tools like teleconferences and online trainings provide so effective that they can continue to be used even after the pandemic. In closing, I wish you a fruitful meeting and look forward to hearing your discussions and learning from your insights and experiences. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And now the floor is Fadi Farra. Dr.
Thank
Farra.
you. Thank you very much, colleagues. Let me share the screen indeed. Just bear with me. Stock, I believe. Here. One moment, if you bear with me. We're all talking about technology, but the foundation is just to be able to share that screen. So hopefully this will work. Well, seems on my end there's a small.
I can do it for you.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Very good. Thank you very much. Very good. If you can put it on slideshow, if it's possible.
Is it already? Second.
Well, I guess it's good enough. It's good enough. All right. Well, thank you. As you can see, we need to trust technology, but also the humans behind technology. So I'm clearly not at that level. Colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and I want to take just a few moments with you to really step back a little bit and look at not just what happened over the past six to 9 months, but also what happened before COVID. And coming back to this fundamental question on why trust and why resilience is so important. And the way I approach the problem, if you want to read more about it, this was published in the Harvard Business Review about 4 or 5 days ago, what I'm just going to tell you about with my colleague Bassam Khouri. And it's really rethinking this question of, if we can just go back to the initial page, this question of trust and resilience. Trust. Trust here doesn't mean that we have to trust more. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. It's actually to trust less. To rely less on the concept of trust. What does it mean? It means that, we always rely on corporate leaders and we tell them, you're empowered and we give you all the trust and you're going to make all the CEO decisions for us. We always rely on the policy makers, we rely on the head of family, or rely on any units that pretty much makes decisions. Well, what we noticed during COVID is that when we were talking about building this little mask here, if you can see them, well, there we go, this little thing here, well, there was no one. It was people to people. There was no government, no company, no charity, nothing. It was people online telling you how things are done in the initial stages. Remember when there was no gloves, no mask, no availability. The question is not if trust is good or not. Of course, trust is positive. But maybe the question is relying less on this concept of trust when it comes to those type of situations. The second question is resilience. Resilience means here the resistance to shocks. Now, the question is, when we talk resilience, it was always been a question of the timing of that resilience. Resistance to shocks within a month, within 2 months, within a year, within 5 years. Where now maybe we have to rethink the time horizon, looking at rethinking maybe not 5, maybe 10, maybe 30 years. Therefore, this resistance to shock should be not just short term, but longer term. And the question of trust should be maybe relying a bit less on it and maybe decentralizing a bit more. Therefore, it's maybe time to change the status quo, basically what we've been doing over the past number of years. Now, what does it mean concretely? What I'm about to tell you is not opinion, it's fact. So we'll share with you some of the research that has been made on this topic. So thanks again for sharing the screen. If you can go to the next page. Thank you. And if it's very good. So thanks again. Maybe you can zoom in or zoom out a little bit. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. So there are two axes here. One axis is the need for trust, and the need for decentralization. So let's say this is on one scale, how much trust, how much decentralization. On the other side, the need for resilience. Resilience is based on about 100 indicators. It's a research that was led by Whiteshell Partners under the guidance of Nobel Prize winner Christopher Pisaderes that we publish every year, which is called the Global Labor Resilience Index. And that's published in Davos every year. And this measures the resistance to shocks by country and even by region. The second axis is the need for centralization or decentralization. So we took this as a proxy of trust. And again, it's based on a number of indicators that have been assessed from the public research available. Now take those two axes and let's look at what it means concretely. You can go to the next page. There are four key buckets here. In the lower left, you have the supervised invisible hands. It means there's typically a low level of decentralization and a low level of resilience. Then you go into the connected realities. This is a rather high level of decentralization and a low level of resilience. Then you have what we call the managed economies. And here you are more into high level of resilience, but low levels of decentralization. And then what we're aiming for, which is the citizen-centric societies, meaning high level of decentralization and high level of resilience. What does it mean concretely? You can go to the next page. How do we get to this citizen-centric societies? You can go to the next page. Thanks again for helping to share. What you see here is the data. Now, this data is scattered over a number of countries. We took here a sample. And it's of course scattered over time. On the vertical axis, you'll see the resilience score. 100 means you're highly resilient, 0 that you have limited resilience. And decentralization is the same way. 100 is a high level of decentralization, and then a low level of decentralization. So let's look at the lower left corner, the supervised invisible hands. Those are countries like Turkey, Russia, or others, Mexico, Colombia. They typically have, strong intervention from the states and typically a level of resilience to shocks which is lower than others. It means that when you have a crisis that hits, well, you see the economy going down, the health going down, the job, the unemployment going up, and so on. And the level of centralization is typically quite high. If you can go to the next page. If you go to connected realities, now those are, again, countries which are more decentralized, like France, like Spain, where you have a high level of decentralization, like the United States. It's a federation, of course, with governance, but limited absorption of shocks. The resilience is actually quite limited, at least what we've seen short term. So here you have promotion of typically innovation, support of startup, typically strong investment into reskilling and training of citizens. So we see we're starting to go to this fundamental unit of analysis, which is people, which is us here around the table. If you go to the next box, if you can move to the next page, here we are into the managed economies. Now, managed economies are typically countries which are much more resilient, but still fairly centralized. Now here you have India, Indonesia, and to some extent the United Kingdom and islands. Now here those countries typically balance quite well long-term policies with their socio-economic targets, but they're still fairly centralized. Now let's look at those countries which are rather citizen-centric. If we go to the next page. Thanks again for sharing. Now here we're talking typically about Switzerland, the Nordic countries, Finland, Norway, but also countries like Canada, Luxembourg, so the Benelux targets. And those countries have two things in common. They empower their regions, and it's not just the unit of the regions. They empower companies, and taxation is typically completely decentralized, but also the level of innovation, the level of unemployment, you have what is called a social contract. And that social contract is much stronger at the local level, which makes it much stronger when you have a crisis. Therefore, resistance to shock is much stronger. Now, this is not theory. I'll show you one example of resilience from the Global Labor Resilience Index we published last year. The rankings will completely change this year, based on COVID-19. So I'll be fast if we can move to the next page. And well, maybe and the next one. Thank you. The question is, where do you move? If you are a centralized with low resilience country, well, how do you become much more resilient, and how do you rely less on trust and decentralize even more? Decentralization, again, is not just states, it's also company. It's also making sure that within a corporation, you decentralize even more. It's not just a country issue. What you see here is the last year ranking on resilience of countries. You see Singapore and Switzerland, where, I mean, Switzerland #1, Singapore #2, and most of the other countries were the Nordic. The only exceptions were the US and the UK. As a preview, I can tell you the United States is definitely not on this top 10 ranking for this year. What matters here is flexibility in labor, in employment, is youth guarantee programs where you provide to the units of where unemployment happens, direct support, regional employment centers, completely decentralized, as opposed to this re-centralization. The Singapore case that, of course, here on retraining, reskilling. But of course, the size of the country here matters. You see all of them here, except two, are fairly small countries. Therefore, this question of the social contract is fundamental between the state, the citizen, the companies, and other countries. Let's take the case of Kazakhstan before we close. If you can move to the next page. What you see here is the labor resilience at the regional level in Kazakhstan. You have 4 tiers. The white tier that probably you don't see much here are the economic cities. So Nur Sultan and Almaty, which are very resilient to economic shocks, or at least more than other regions. Then you have tier 2, and you see here Pavlodar or other regions to the west. And then you see the tier 3 and tier 4 regions, some of them like Western Kazakhstan, or like Jambil, that has now a new name, that had a lot lower resilience to economic shocks. And this can go down to the city, and this can go down to the household. So what's the learning? And I'll probably stop here if you can go to the last page. I think the learning is we should not be ignorant of the COVID-19 crisis. And there is a tendency, and we work with a lot of countries. And sorry, if you can go to the previous page, apologies, page 15. When we were working with many countries during the crisis, in the heat of the situation, we were not really relying on government or companies. We were relying on people at the airport telling us, do we stop the airline or not? We're relying on people in schools, teachers, headmasters saying, do we close schools or not? We're relying on people in hospitals. It's this network effect that allowed us to really advise effectively governments on, do we lock, do we don't lock, do we stop and go, and so on. The network idea is important. Therefore, the first learning is less governance centralization. The second learning is more supply chain redundancies. You've seen the supply chain challenges we had between countries. All countries locked down. Well, how do I get my order from Amazon? How do I get my order from eBay? And so on. You saw the delays that were happening along the way. More fluid integration of technology. So how important that this was. Revising the policy metrics, thinking whole of country and whole of governments. not divisions of department, divisions of ministries, working very well between the city level and the center. Financing the future, you know, there's this big issue that still happens where we're looking at financial markets with very short-term actions. Well, rethinking about financing, long-term financing, not just the short-term financing. And the most important parts, and I'll stop here, is refocusing time horizon. And therefore not thinking just short-term, but thinking not 1 year, but maybe 5 years, or maybe 10 years. And it's just a few thoughts to share with you. Apologies again for taking a bit longer, and look forward to discussion after that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is Vitalis Nakrosis from Vilnius University.
Mr. Nakrosis, we cannot.
Sorry. Okay, I'm going to cover 3 issues during my presentation, ranging from the challenges of the COVID-19 crisis to agility and adaptivity of public sector organizations. So starting from the nature of the COVID-19 crisis, the spread of a very contagious coronavirus first created a very complex and complicated public health crisis. Also, lockdowns introduced by different governments generated not only demand shocks and supply disruptions, but also brought frequent regulatory changes in national economies. Therefore, a multi-level and multi-sector response was necessary in order to cope with this crisis. Also, since the COVID-19 crisis is characterized as a burning and slow burning and creeping crisis, it produced an exhausting effect on decision makers, and this can be demonstrated by the level of stress had by the Lithuanian Minister of Finance, who was found smoking during the online meeting of the Lithuanian government while discussing financial and economic measures of coping with the crisis. Also, during the crisis, we observed at least 2 paradigm shifts. The first shift from containment to mitigation in terms of strategies for managing the coronavirus, because lockdowns are no longer favored. And another shift in the management of systemic threats, from preventing systemic threats to building resilience in public administration systems, because systemic threats are uncertain and hard to predict. That's why we need to build resilience into the systems. And that's why, from the academic point of view, the crisis was called as a game changer, but from the practitioner's point of view, this created the problem of a moving target, further complicating response efforts. So based on our framework of analysis, I will focus on a mix of governance capacity and legitimacy that determines crisis management and the effectiveness of policy response, because a flexible response structure with rapid response teams should be put in place, especially in terms of dispersing information across different jurisdictions and operational domains, and this should occur in a very suitable and favorable political context, because crisis management should not be politicized or politically exploited for political short-term gains. And in order to demonstrate the importance of these factors, I will briefly present the Lithuanian case, because Lithuania experienced a major U-turn from high to low response strategy. In mid-March 2020, Lithuania was fourth most stringent in Europe in terms of its response measures, while in mid-September 2020, Lithuania became the second least stringent in terms of its response strategy. And this was made possible by the policy of successfully locking and starting to grow. So the government's policy successfully unlock and grow was enabled by a quick and effective locking. And Bertelsmann Foundation produced the pilot COVID-19 index that demonstrated that small countries, including all Baltic countries, made the 5 top countries in terms of containing the coronavirus, and the Lithuanian economy experienced a very mere reduction in terms of real GDP. And this was part of the government's COVID-19 strategy, whose main purpose was to control the short-term spread of the COVID-19 crisis and virus in order to adequately prepare for next waves and to reduce the impact on public health and the country's economy. But the main point that in order to implement this strategy, a sufficient government capacity and legitimacy is necessary, which is a precondition for achieving a good deal of agility and adaptivity in public sector organizations and public administration systems. I have no time to go into detail in relation to agility, adaptivity, and resilience, but I will present a set of 3 instruments that could be useful for achieving agility and adaptivity. So in terms of real-time data and analytics, mobilization of additional resources, and collaborative governance. So starting from data intelligence and experimentation, Lithuanian authorities developed dashboards with real-time data, also employed drones to monitor compliance with lockdown conditions in the country, or use different apps to gather information on self-isolation. And these tools were used in order to constantly remix interventions based on the epidemiological situation and actual needs, and made it possible to constantly readjust the situation. But we didn't have these tools in advance before the start of the crisis, so we needed to develop them in order to enable this rapid response to the crisis. Another example is the mobilization of resources, both in society and governmental institutions. And I will tell about this mobilization from my own experience, because I had a contact with the person who became infected with the coronavirus. So I tested the system and the extent to which it is fast enough. So my contact was traced within 1 day. Then my test was implemented within 1.5 days, and its results were announced within another 24 hours. So we used existing mobile drive-in testing facilities in order to test and trace contacts and gather information on the spread of the virus within the society. And thanks to accessibility of these testing facilities and services, society complied and participated in these testing procedures in order to gather evidence on the actual spread of the coronavirus in the country. And my final point is about the style of leadership necessary during the crisis, because during the peak of the crisis, some decision makers argued that a military command and control type of leadership is necessary to overcome the crisis. And in the picture on this slide, you can see our head of operations, the Minister for Healthcare, wearing a military uniform and participating in military exercises that demonstrates the military command and control style that was popular during the peak of the crisis. But the majority of our interview respondents now agree that it was a more democratic or a more collaborative government.
Could you please speak a little bit slowly? For
yes.
Thank
yes,
you.
It was collaborative governance supported by open and democratic leadership that made a difference to countries' response to the crisis, and made it possible for Lithuanian authorities to implement effective response solutions in an agile and adaptive way. And I think it is this collaborative style of governments that is also useful for developing resilient approaches to public administration in the future that are necessary for resisting similar crises and overcoming their negative effects. So that's it for the presentation.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. The floor is now Dr. Leitner's.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes?
Perfect.
Great, great. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Alikan Baymenov for inviting, and his team, of course, for inviting me to this very interesting panel. I've already heard so much and was so inspired. I'd also like to thank the conference organizers and Nazarbayev University, because I think you have, or are doing actually, and we see that now we're witnessing it at the moment, a brilliant job in using and harnessing technology, you know, to connect us all and to enable us to continue discussions and working on our jobs. Anyway, I'd like to share my slides with you and a few thoughts that I have actually had on the topic that I would like to discuss with you. Let me just see if it works. I think it does, right? Yes. So I'm going to look into a different angle of, COVID-related governance responses, and that is the technology angle. I mean, we've heard a lot of things already that I am referring to in my presentations, but I'd really focus on, let's say, the technology angle and the digital developments in relation to the COVID crisis and beyond. Now, all of us have experienced the nightmare. We woke up earlier this year to a situation nobody would have dreamt of. It really looked like a bad science fiction movie to us. So it was not virtual reality like in Matrix that really shocked us, but it was actually, the virus that had hit the world and brought the world basically to a standstill. The main things that I've learned, that I see, is that people increasingly turn to government at this point in time in the crisis, and that required from government functioning institutions and functioning and effective governance mechanisms. At the same time, technology was the panacea, if you will, or was the resort to help us come through the crisis and to continue at least parts of the life that we have known. What was really striking is that we could see with the speed of adoption of technology in very different areas is really the opportunities technology provides and the digital provides, but also the vulnerabilities that we're exposed to. Now, if we go back to, let's say, a year ago, and these discussions on the digital technologies, disruptive technologies, frontier technologies, and policy issues that emerged, the policy discussions, we all were aware of the discussions on 5G developments and what it means, for a smart city development, for example, but also for digital government development. So 5G, Internet of Things, big data analytics, artificial intelligence, distributed ledger technologies, blockchain, in other words. So the huge opportunities for government transformation, development of smart cities, but also the issues that arose related to cybersecurity and digital sovereignty, the opportunities of evidence-based policymaking, but then again, on the other hand, the issues related to data security and privacy, and in general, trust issues, what we've heard before, and the need to rethink and rebalance social contract. At the same time, there was this kind of more global trends that were raising issues about vulnerabilities that we're exposed to. And in part, technology reinforced these vulnerabilities. On the other hand, technology actually helped us, or was an opportunity to mitigate some of these trends that we saw coming. There are three trends that I basically have identified. One is the limits of growth that we've seen, and it's related particularly also to the visible strains on our planet's resources. The increasing protectionist behaviors of nation states and increasing inequalities in incomes and wealth. Limits to national sovereignty. We saw that in particular in relation to technology, tensions between the globally enabled interconnectedness with the danger we saw that national sovereignty would see its limits. It was in danger through the use or the use of technology and the emergence of big players in the digital era. And another thing that has been mentioned is the declining trust in government. Even before the crisis, we saw that inequalities were growing and there was a loss of social cohesion in many regions of the world. Rise of populism, rejection of expert elites, and the government in general, the failure basically, or the difficulties that we saw that government has to regulate the digital sphere. Now, there comes the crisis, and we see these issues reinforced. And one thing that I mentioned before is what we see much more clearly now with this rapid use and application of technologies that we were forced to actually do. We can see more clearly the importance and the fragilities or the vulnerabilities that technology brings with it. For example, in international cooperation, the mobility restrictions have forced us all to work online, and it's amazing how we manage to do that. It has had an impact on the global value chains and, you know, the availability of digital goods, if you will. It has had an impact on, again, digital sovereignty and the what we call strategic autonomy of nation states and governments. Policy making and crisis management, again, we've heard examples for this. We saw that all of a sudden expert opinions were high in demand, and technology would help us to have more science-led policy making, real-time data collection, analysis, forecasting, and sharing of data nationally, globally, locally, has become extremely important, and we see striking and very impressive examples of this. We also saw that technology has played or will play or can play a very important role in enforcement. One example was there for the drones, for example, in Lithuania, the use of drones, but also, you know, to ensure transparency and effective communication. Most importantly, from my point of view, because this is sort of the area closest to my heart, is the civil service resilience. It is amazing how some or many countries have managed to move from one day to the other, you know, to teleworking, teleconferencing, and have come to grips with coordination, information sharing, using technology. Those countries that were sort of mature in providing digital government services were at an advantage. And we could see also e-health and e-education services really helping us in this crisis. So civil service resilience also saw, of course, you know, the vulnerabilities in terms of the capacities we didn't have, the silo structure, the flexible structures we didn't have, and the digital skills that were actually lacking. Civil society empowerment, another angle where this kind of use of technology becomes obvious again. For those who were not connected, we could see that the digital divide is really sort of opening up enormously. So connectivity, access to service, digital literacy are extremely important. We saw also the cooperation at different levels, public, private, and with civil society and co-creation. We've heard some examples of this, and we saw a change in consumption behavior, be it of government services or other services. Again, here we saw the problem if you're not connected or if you cannot deal with the digital, that you are running the risk of being excluded. Now, I've chosen 3 examples here of applications that that show the dilemma that policymakers are actually facing with the use of technology, like the tracing apps, the use of drones, contactless payments. They always require to have clear policy choices on what is the outcome, the objectives we try to achieve. The drones for enforcement, supply of deliveries. The contactless payment to accelerate commerce or help vulnerable groups. We always have to have in mind balancing the objective of, is it the public health? Is it the data protection we have in mind? Is it the policy objective that we put most emphasis on, surveillance or else? In a nutshell, learning from COVID-19 as a catalyst for transforming governance, my answer would be yes, but we need to recalibrate our digital policies, and we need to mainstream the digital in all policies. What is important is to focus on public sector capacity and resilience, to make sure that all the policies and actions we take are inclusive and sustainable. And we need to rethink, and that has been mentioned as well, about a renewed social contract to make clear what is the relationship between the government, the state, the public sector, the citizens. So it's up to us what we're going to do and how we're going to use the potential of technology to improve our governance mechanisms and systems. And I think it is very important that we keep in mind the Sustainable Development Goals and we try to commit ourselves to really accelerate the speed of implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for another wonderful presentation. And before I give the floor to Karin Badra, I have to make 2 small announcements. The first is that at the end of this first day of the conference at 5:30, we are all invited to come back to the Pine platform on which we are broadcasting the conference, so that you have a chance to see the wrap-up of day 1 and get a glimpse of what the program is for the second day of the conference that will take place tomorrow. That's the first announcement. The second one is that please try to stick, this is an announcement to the speakers, try to respect your 10-11 minutes time allotment, so that we can still have some time at the end of this session for an extensive Q&A with the participants that are submitting a great deal of interesting questions. And third, this is a request from the translators, try to speak not as fast as I do, because otherwise that creates problems for translators to do their job. Thank you very much. Dr. Badra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. In order for me to share my screen, the previous presenter would need to close her screen.
Christine, please take, yeah, brilliant.
Sorry for that.
No problem, okay. Give me a few minutes from my side.
Can you?
Yes, normally. Can everyone see the screen? Great. So just very quickly to set the tone. So my name is Karin Badr, and I would like to thank you very much for this invitation, and thank all the previous panelists who have raised extremely interesting points. To set the tone, basically I work in the OECD's Open Government Unit, and we help countries across the world open up their governments and put citizens at the heart of policymaking. Now, for a very long time, we have seen that public communication was a missing variable of this work. Basically, the people in charge of public communication were meant to communicate mostly a political agenda in a one-way sort of communication style, and they were not necessarily engaging in strategic communication that can support open government principles such as transparency or participation, integrity, or accountability. And so that's why we have been working on a really interesting project that we will soon be launching, which is the OECD's first international report on public communication to be published next year, which really helps to bridge the evidence gap on this. We're basically looking at how communication contributes to transparency, engagement, participation, and also trying to reinforce the awareness and the use of communication for more strategic purposes. And this is why basically here I would like to share with you some key preliminary findings from this international report that we will soon be sharing, because they are very much relevant to the COVID-19 crisis. Just a note on the statistics and the analysis that you're seeing online. This is a preliminary version of the analysis, which covers around 60 survey responses from 45 countries, including OECD countries and non-OECD countries. And the surveys were basically targeting centers of government and ministries of health. So really people that were very much in the front line of responding to the COVID-19 crisis. Now we've all seen how COVID has heralded huge disruption to the daily lives of citizens, businesses, and governments. Governments have had to react in unprecedented ways, and especially because the crisis has necessitated novel responses and very quick breakneck speed responses from the governments. The crisis has re-emphasized the role of the state. We've all seen that clearly. But how ready were communicators to fight this pandemic? And we've seen that they really were at the front line of nudging or instructing large segments of the population, to comply with measures, whether it was regarding hand washing or wearing masks or lockdowns, etc. Now, when you look at this slide, in terms of human and financial resources, it looks like public communicators, across the world were not that unprepared. Around 80% say that communication competencies were challenging due to human resource reasons. And around 50% say that communication was challenging due to financial reasons. And actually, when you look into a little bit more details in terms of the budget, what we see is that very few countries actually have a dedicated budget related to communication, which was, played a key role during this pandemic. Now, for a bit of a broader picture, basically this slide, we asked countries what were your top 3 challenging communication competencies. And here what we see is that the first one was producing communication strategies, and I'll go back to this particular element to explain why this was important during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second most challenging aspect was crisis communication, not surprising, and finally, evaluations. Now here what's interesting with regards to crisis communication is that when we asked countries more details about why crisis communication was a challenge, the main reason they told us was coordination. So we've seen in many countries that coordinating the response from a communication perspective was led by the center of government. Basically, this is the body that provides support to the highest level of the executive. The tone was set from the top in a number of countries. For example, in France, the president and the prime minister were communicating live across a variety of platforms. Only yesterday, France's Emmanuel Macron was also speaking during a live interview with 2 journalists. In Canada, the prime minister delivered updates in person on a nearly daily basis. This was also the case in Colombia, for example, and many of you might have seen the New Zealand's Prime Minister using social media. I mean, in addition to formal high-level press briefings, she also engaged in informal Facebook Live discussions and chats. So these are issues that help set the narrative, that help ensure coherence of messaging, but we've seen that coordination still remained a challenge in terms of the communication side. And our report is looking to analyze a little bit more why that was the case. Were the coordination mechanisms for crisis communication outdated or too burdensome? Were they too much influenced by, for example, political actors or external actors? Or also, for example, were they defined on paper but harder to implement in practice? Another interesting area that we've seen with regards to communication is that countries were not necessarily used to partnering with external stakeholders. So this is sort of what you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, including social media influencers. I mean, we've seen how this proved immensely helpful in order to reach the specific segments of the population. So an example of this was Finland, who targeted youth on social media by working, the government worked with social media influencers to share the message, especially with youth being a segment of the population that is harder to reach through traditional media outlets like TV or radio or press, for example. And another example of this was South Korea with its Thanks Challenge. So the Ministry of Health in Korea basically urged people to share pictures and messages and with a gesture saying thank you to frontline healthcare workers. This was also used by a number of celebrities in Korea and sort of with helping basically the government send out a message using all segments of the population. We have another example I wanted to share with you is also linked to adapting messaging based on your target audience, which is a really important element in this regard. In Mexico, the government designed a cartoon called Susana Distancia, which was mainly aimed at youth and children to really also inform them and help the parents that were trying to explain as they were sending their kids to school why the kids needed to take these measures. Another area that we've seen was extremely important for communication was using communication for behavior change. So a majority of respondents to our survey expressed that they do interact as communicators with behavioral insights experts, but that they made limited use of this in their digital communication. So there really we saw a missed opportunity. I mean, the survey for this was for 2019, but clearly if in 2019 communicators were not working as much as needed with experts on behavioral insights, how are we expected to have seen in our countries communication geared to changing the behavior or the perception of government? This is also a slide to show really this missed opportunity. When you look at how countries evaluate their public communication strategies and initiatives, what we see is, so on the top right-hand side of the slide, is basically that less than 10% around 50%, sorry, of countries actually measure behavior change when they go forward with their communication initiatives. So this is not something that countries are actually doing with regards to their communication strategies. Another really missed opportunity here that I wanted to take your attention to was that not only is comms communications not being used in most countries to change behaviors directly, but also communication is not being used that much to engage with stakeholders, to encourage participation. Less than 10% of countries said that the main objective of their communication strategy is to encourage participation. I might drop this slide quickly just for the sake of time to maybe focus on this last one that might be of interest for participants, especially because we've talked about trust from a number of angles with the previous speakers. At the OECD, we have identified 4 drivers of trust, of citizen trust in government. And we have tried to look at how has communication contributed to each of these drivers of trust. So if you could follow, for example, the first driver, which is responsiveness, we've seen that communication could do a lot more to contribute to this driver, because in terms of the uptake of services, this is a low priority for governments. Governments do not yet use communication to improve the take-up or to improve the delivery of a service. So there are the people in charge of, for example, digital service in one unit and the people in charge of communication, and these two communities are not necessarily reinforcing each other. On integrity of communication, which is an extremely important element that we have seen, and also with regards to many ethical considerations that have been raised with regards to using communication as a strategic lever of government during the pandemic, less than 50% have tailored guidelines for communicators. So if you are someone in charge of the social media page of the Ministry of Health somewhere in the world, odds are, more likely than not, you have no idea about necessarily what to do in a given circumstance. Is this an ethical way of responding or not? What do you do when you receive hate speech or a message that you think is controversial? So while there are some mechanisms to ensure ethics, most of these are the general codes of ethics for the public administration. But what we're seeing is communicators are facing issues with regards to what they can actually do, with regards to dilemmas they might face in their communication, namely through social media platform. On openness and fairness, there's a positive observation. Not everything is bleak. Transparency is a key objective of communication strategies and initiatives. So basically, we're seeing more and more countries proactively disclose information, put up more information. We've seen immense open data sets that were extremely useful with regards to engaging the population in analyzing the number of cases, etc., things like that. So this is extremely important. But openness and fairness is also about engaging different stakeholders in the decision making. And here, we've seen that communication for participation, as I've shown you in the previous slide, this was not an objective. So basically, in most countries, we're expecting interested citizens or businesses to find the information in order to engage with the administration on public decision making, whereas it's extremely complicated often to sort of find that information in some countries and in some certain websites. And then the final driver is on reliability. So this is basically the ability of governments to minimize uncertainty. And here, several elements with regards to communication could be improved.
You have 1 minute.
Yes, I will wrap up. So these include communication strategies, improving crisis communication, but also strengthening the responses to disinformation. For the sake of time, I won't go into the role of communication in responding to disinformation. We have two extremely detailed papers that have analyzed the role of public communicators to respond to disinformation specifically. So maybe I won't give you examples on that, and I can wrap up if you said I have 1 more minute. Just by saying that basically we've seen that communication has been at the forefront of answering and responding to the pandemic, but that we also see that it is an instrument of government that is often underused and is often misunderstood by governments. And so our report sort of looks into what are the elements that can help improve that. And I'll conclude by saying that the crisis has given added prominence to the open government and the communication agendas. So the urge here is really for governments to use this momentum to make progress on the priorities of the public communication agenda and the open government agenda. And here it's particularly important to help rebuild economies and societies in the medium term, but also to help improve resilience and strengthen trust in the more longer term. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. The floor is goes to Dr. Singh.
Good morning, everybody from London. I hope you're well. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'd like to also thank the audience, which clearly is a mix of policymakers from the region and also students from the university. I'm always aware that audiences tend to get bored if you're the 4th or 5th speaker, so I will try to be brief within the 10 minutes. Let me try and synthesize what other colleagues, speakers have said, just to give a flavor of what I'm about to speak. Can you confirm you can see my slides?
No, I don't see your slides.
Bear with.
Should I do
Okay,
it
tell
for
me
you?
when you can. Tell me if it's gone through. If not, you can do it for me. Yeah, if you can do it for me, please. So while our colleagues from Kazakhstan are putting the presentation up, let me say that what I'm about to present is more a helicopter vision in terms of the economics of it. Other speakers have spoken, starting with Mr. Baimov, about the keywords of trust and transparency in the COVID setting. Mr. Barris from the UNDP, I think, hits the key macro buttons in terms of the implications for COVID on healthcare, development, and inequality, which some other speakers spoke about. Mr. Fabia spoke about the resilience and trust issues, which I think are both valid in terms of short and long term. And he mentioned, I think, quite clearly, which I'll touch on also, the issue of shocks. And I think what we're facing in many ways are both economic and political shocks. And other speakers spoke about the capacity issue. My assessment overall and conclusion for this presentation is that, in a way, it comes down to policy, implementation, and capacity to implement change, and fundamentally, the financing available. So the financing, just to give you a flavor, in the United Kingdom, our government here has spent the equivalent of $300 billion thus far, and probably that will accelerate next year. The European Union has recently agreed a COVID recovery fund, which is about $1 trillion, the 750 million euros. The United States is currently talking about an agreement of between $1 and $2 trillion, depending on the outcome of the election. So ultimately, change will come through the budget, and that's the key message. Very good. So the first slide is, since we're talking ostensibly to students from Kazakhstan, what is the situation in terms of growth? Well, the story and the expectation when I wrote this a few weeks ago, and it still remains the case, was there was some letter in the alphabet, and the diagram there shows for the region over 3 years the expected growth. And I've highlighted the central one where CCOAE covers Kazakhstan. And basically the expectation was that it was going to be a V-shaped recovery. A drop because of COVID, people can't go to work, economies are closed, economies cannot trade, followed by a growth after the pandemic. Other people were expecting a U-shaped, a slower recovery, or even a W. People are now talking about so-called K recovery, and that links with one or two speakers spoke previously, namely that some people may do well out of it, others will not do well out of it, and so there's an issue about what do you do for vulnerable communities. What we don't know, and this is the key point in many respects from a policy perspective, is that we actually don't know about the unknowns. So we have COVID. Sorry, can you go back to the previous slide? So the unknowns that we're in COVID at the moment. In many ways, we're facing the second wave in many countries. But in a way, we don't know when the antiviral treatment will come out. Will there be a third wave? Will there be COVID-20? And so in a sense, when ministries of finance and fiscal agencies, and indeed central banks, are projecting in the next 2 years, their expectations are bounded by a sense that there will be a recovery and antiviral treatment available. But it could well be that we are facing a situation into 2 or maybe 3 years. So that's something to consider. Longer term issues have been mentioned by people, but I'll briefly mention one point, and that is that the zoonotic diseases is becoming now more prevalent. In other words, the ability of viruses to jump species. And we've seen in recent years, COVID, SARS, Ebola. So there is now clearly a fundamental risk that countries, which are obviously very interconnected now, will face further and new pandemics. And so in a way, countries are beginning to think about risk registers and how to, in a way, prepare for that. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is a very brief graph taken from the IMF, which shows, as of the summer, the situation in terms of the fiscal support. In other words, the amount of money that ministries of finance can provide. Of course, ministries of finance are constrained because they have to raise revenue either through taxes or borrowing, and then they spend. And we refer to that as economists as fiscal space or policy space. And you can see there are two lines. One is the average for the world, around 4% of GDP. The other is for emerging and developing economies, which is lower. And the point I wanted to make here, and you can see at the bottom, Kazakhstan is sort of just below that, is that in a way, the ability to spend and the ability to borrow is unique for countries. And it depends on your macroeconomic situation. It depends on how much fiscal space, in other words, how much room you have. And what we found across the developing and transition economies, whether you're an oil producer or not, is that all of them are constrained and all of them are having to spend emergency funding for healthcare because that's the priority. And therefore, available financing for other things is decreased. And since the economies are shrinking, countries are having to borrow, or central banks are having to basically have very easy monetary policy. I'll mention there briefly the implications for sustainable development goals and financing for policy. I've been advising governments for the last 20 years, and I've worked for the OECD, World Bank, and I was part of the European Commission's team for EU accession. And I find myself now struggling as I sometimes work with the United Nations, that the focus on SDGs in a way is very difficult to envisage because countries and developing countries often find that while they're happy to think about goals in 2030, their priority is tomorrow. How do you make sure that vulnerable communities have the resources, they have roofs over their head, healthcare expenditure, are teachers being paid? And that is a fundamental challenge for particularly developing countries. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Kazakhstan. So the next few slides are just a flavor of the way international metrics for governance assess globally the country. So if I'm an investor, it will be more or less the same thing, whether I'm looking at indices from Fitch or Standard & Poor. If I'm a foreign direct investor, the same thing. This is taken from the World Governance Indicators from the World Bank, which some of you will know is capturing 80 underlying sets of survey data. And this is internationally used. And you can see there the colors. I hope you can see it. So green is good, red is bad, pink is sort of in the middle. And you can see Kazakhstan is more or less in the middle in terms of voice and accountability. Next slide, please. And we're going to go through a couple of these just to give you a picture. Again, in terms of government effectiveness, Kazakhstan is somewhere in the middle, which is comparable to the region. Next slide, please. Control of corruption. Actually, Kazakhstan is not so good relative to the region. So that's something to obviously to pick up on. Next slide, please. So coming to the sort of summary of the presentation, what is the new normal? I will give you 5 points that occur to me, and those of us in policy are thinking about. One is that probably for the first time since possibly World War II, we see a synchronized economic slowdown globally. What do I mean by that? Well, in the last 30, 40 years, every country goes through an economic cycle, and that economists refer to as a business cycle. But what often happens is that when a number of countries are going through a slowdown, there'll be other countries that are going in an upturn. They're actually growing, or vice versa. Because of the pandemic, for the first time, pretty much every country in the world is facing a synchronized slowdown. What we also see, point 2, and some of the speakers have already spoken about this, is that there are structural changes within the economies which have been accelerated. So if I speak from the perspective of London, central London is sometimes like a ghost town at the moment because most workers, be it for investment banks or other companies, and indeed the public sector, are likely to come in. There is an increased risk of, point 3, pandemics, global warming. These are risks which remain there. And I think in a way now we have this sort of mix with the pandemic coming through. The other thing that I think strikes one is that what we see, and some of the people sort of hinted at, is that what we see now is a genuine paradigm shift in terms of public finances and public policy, in that probably for the first time since Thatcherism and Reaganism, we are beginning to see an increased role of the state, both in terms of the expenditure, but also possibly nationalization of industries. And indeed, central banks, I mean, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, in the post-Soviet environment, we were advising as economists and policy advisors for central banks not to finance the budget. But that's basically what we're doing now everywhere. So the final point I will make is many experts are speaking about public administrative reform, and really it comes down to the money. You can implement policy change and capacity changes only through the budget. Thank you very much. Last couple of slides, if I have a minute, I can just highlight. Thank you.
You're over time. I'm sorry. It's the turn of Paul Reynolds.
Super. Thank you very much.
Paul?
Yes, I'll just unmute myself. I will attempt to try and load a slide. If not, then you'll have to do it for me, but should be all right. Let's have a look. Document. Difficult to find. It might be quicker if you could, I've only got 2 slides, so it's very easy. Are you able to, yes. So if you go to the first slide, I'll just say thank you very much for inviting me. And it's very nice to be amongst friends here. And my thanks to the Astana Civil Service Hub and to Nazarbayev University, Graduate School of Public Policy and the UNDP, and also to the OECD, indeed, which has been doing some excellent work. And of course, I must thank His Excellency President Tokayev and Prime Minister Askar Mamin for their support for the government reform programs. So if you just I'll just put up the next page of the slide, and I'll go into their content. Kazakhstan itself has been engaged for quite some time, and now, thanks to His Excellency the President and Prime Minister, at an accelerated pace, to move away from the command and control government system, which was prevalent during the Soviet era, And the modernizations have been very substantial indeed and much lauded around the world. So in particular, the civil service reform and even bringing in people who are not even Kazakh nationals into the civil service, and the decentralization reforms have been very important. Although the decentralization reforms have been, I think, slower than the government would have liked. It's partially because the oil revenues do rather create a situation where it's a case of he who pays the piper calls the tune. But nevertheless, the government is persisting with those reforms, and there's been some benefit from that during the COVID-19 crisis. But one of the themes of this conference, in this part of the conference, is that for the government to be effective in dealing with crises, it is necessary for there to be a sincere relationship with the public, or at least as sincere as one can reasonably expect, and that is absolutely right. But the COVID-19 problem has cast the spotlight onto a number of problems which have affected Kazakhstan in a particular way because of the history and structure of government. And I think what one sometimes finds with the increasing complexity in government is that people at the center, and even to an extent people in the regions, when they pull a lever and expect something to happen, the response on the ground is not always as good as one would hope and expect. And perhaps it's because something which I want to elaborate upon, just looking at this slide here, is that the interactions that people have with government on a day-to-day basis are always more numerous than the recipients of government communications. And so the day-to-day reality of people's interface with government always dominates. And when things go wrong at the interface, this has an effect on sincerity and an effect on what happens when you pull a lever at the center. So, we have not only the COVID-19 crisis, but for Kazakhstan and its economy, where the oil revenues are not as great as they perhaps might have been planned to be, quite reasonably. Nobody expected the COVID-19 crisis. But the key problem I want to just highlight is the problem in developing that sincerity and understanding those interactions with government is the role of the structure of government in this. Because if you're in a government ministry with a specific range of functions and hopefully a well-defined relationship between central and sub-central government, the world looks relatively simple because you have your tasks and functions, and you have your performance criteria, which the government, which His Excellency President Tokayev brought in. So you have these factors. But if you're a kind of recipient of government services, or you're looking for a license, or all your interactions that you have, they're not quite as simple as they seem when you're at the top of a ministry. So this is something which the governments have to take into account. Every government faces the same problem, but it's particularly acute given the history of Kazakhstan. And the simplicity in the ministries and the complexity if you're just a member of the public is difficult to define. And it's the sort of thing that you might imagine, when you in a country where you need an ID card to pay your taxes, but to pay your taxes you need an ID card, and you go around in circles, and all these sorts of administrative loops that people get into, and which cause people to lose a trust and faith in how the government works and its responsibility. But I will just say some simple things about remedies, and we can discuss this later in the Q&A. But it means that I think government needs to look again at how the emphasis it puts on the achievement of objectives as opposed to traditional definitions of what individual ministries do. I think in the Chinese government, they have the commissions, and all governments have some kind of pan-governmental organizations focused on end results, but they're not always really engaged across government and not always engaged directly with the experiences of the general public. So I think the Chinese commissions have played a big role in Chinese economic success because, as well as the traditional ministries, they cover objectives that span the whole of government. I think clarity in decentralization is very important. It is difficult to get clarity in the relative responsibilities of central and subnational government, especially when you have a top-down system of oil revenue distribution. And all countries that have high oil revenues face that same problem. In Nigeria, they have a particular way of doing it, for example. And there's another issue, which is a remedy, if you like, is to make sure that when it comes to government communications with the public, that the cart doesn't come before the horse. That the media and communication strategy doesn't run the policy. That the strategy and the policy comes first. And then you might say the strategy is what to say. You might say, and then the communications is how to say it. But these difficulties can be addressed, and it's important to recognise that these are universal difficulties. And if the government wants to achieve greater value for money, or as the Americans say, bigger bang for your buck, in government, then a range of reforms looking at focused on the experiences of the public is an important thing to take into account. So thank you very much. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now is the turn of Dr. Godaverdiev.
Hello, everybody. Honorable panelists, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good days from Azerbaijan, from Baku. It's my pleasure honor to address the audience today on this important topic of the governance and trust in the new reality. Taking this opportunity, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizers for initiating an event on such a noteworthy topic and creating a platform for us to mutually share our vision and experiences regarding this issue. I also make just a presentation. So 1 second, I'm going to share it. So, can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, great. 1 second. Yes. Yes, it has already been the several months that the world lives in and grapples with this new reality, the pandemic. Being a terrifying experience to our globe, COVID-19 has also proved that thesis that governments have to be flexible and agile in their policies in order to fit into force major changes and adjust to the unforeseen new circumstances. On this account, Azerbaijani government has been illustrated as a success story from the start of the pandemic. Azerbaijan's response to the pandemic has not only been too agile, but also significantly multi-directional and diverse as well. Actions have been taken on all the important sectors without focusing exclusively on one field, while neglecting another. Before going into the details, it should be highlighted that during this period, the most important matter of concern has been and continues to be health and well-being of the citizens. To elaborate, medical and socio-economic sectors have been considered with equal importance while primary measures against COVID-19 were prepared. Task force under the Cabinet of Ministers of the Republic of Azerbaijan and a special coronavirus response fund have been established by the government as essential institutional steps in the fight against COVID-19. In the medical field, more than 20 hospitals have been upgraded and equipped, and several other new modular hospitals have been opened for the treatment of COVID-19 patients. Along with that, the work of more than 20 labs has been dedicated to conducting COVID-19 tests across Azerbaijan. Azerbaijani government has allocated more than $2 billion for mitigating the hazardous effects on the socio-economic sector in this field. To that end, business enterprises that suffered from the pandemic have been provided with financial support, and also the significant amount of salaries of the people working in the private sector has been paid directly by the government. Furthermore, financial assistance to the unemployed people has been also included into the support package. As I have already mentioned, the measures by Azerbaijani government against COVID-19 are not limited with medical and socioeconomic sectors. Special focus has been put on the public administration as well. Specifically, rendering public services during this harsh period has been at the center of attention, and several necessary steps have been taken to that end. As the distinguished audience is already aware of, public service in Azerbaijan are rendered through Asan service centers run by the State Agency for Public Service and Social Innovations under the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan. And even during the quarantine period, the centers ensured unhindered access to public services. It should be also noted that the directions of the State Agency are not limited to rendering the public services, but also extended to innovations, digital solutions, and social projects. Let me shortly inform you about the functions of the Asan Service Center. Asan, the meaning of Asan is easy in Azerbaijani language, and was established on the initiative of the President of Azerbaijan back in 2012 as an integral part of the reforms in the sphere of public administration. Over 300 services are rendered in 20 Asan service centers and through the mobile services. And we have, meantime, we have a couple of the private services within the framework of the public-private partnership. Up until today, the services have been rendered to the citizens based on around 40 million applications. I should also mention that in 2019, Asan Service mobile application was launched. Through Asan Khidmat Asan Service app, users can register themselves and can create a personal account. They can apply for the desired services and they get list of the necessary documents for the requested service and to take a queue. The mobile application became especially handy during the pandemic period. This year has clearly illustrated the reality that coming up with timely smart solutions and innovative decisions in the essence of the 21st century public administration. It's a pleasure to note that Asan Service has exactly acted in this way and has got positive feedback, not only in the country, but beyond the borders as well. Moreover, several new services have been digitalized by the eGov Development Center under the state agency in order to ease the access for the citizens. Let me quickly inform the audience that the using of the modern technologies, the center ensures the provision of the information and electronic services by the related state bodies for all citizens of Azerbaijan, as well as the legal entities and foreigners. At the moment, the period of the transition from reactive services to proactive services has been going on. Taking into consideration this substantial change, a new electronic portal, My Government, like MyGov, was introduced to the public. MyGov is an e-service system rendering services of government and private entities in a single platform based on a forward-looking government. By the use of this portal, the citizens will get acquainted with their personal data provided by the government agencies, access to e-services, and be able to verify the accuracy of their personal data to transfer right information to other entities for regulating this process. In the realm of the innovation and digitalization, another important and innovative action taken against the spread of the coronavirus has been the introduction of the electronic permit system in Azerbaijan. When the special quarantine regime was declared in Azerbaijan back in this March in this year, to decrease the possibility of transmission and hereby the number of the cases, the need for the controlling the movement of citizens emerged. Therefore, the system for obtaining permits and monitoring during the implementation of special quarantine regime was introduced by our eGov Development Center. The system was developed in a way that it managed to operate without technical drawbacks, even at the periods of the highest load. The system operates in two versions. The first version is a short message SMS system, and the other is the website where the e-system for permits and monitoring to be applied during the special quarantine regime. This system has attained positive feedback and attention abroad as well. It has been researched by several foreign countries, including the United Arab Emirates, the Montenegro, and a couple of our partners, including the Kazakhstan, the Turkestan region of the Kazakhstan. And it has been applied in the Turkestan region of the Kazakhstan very successfully. By the way, I thank for the Astana Civil Service Hub for sharing this our experience to their to the peers, and through using the channel of the Astana Civil Service Hub, we just achieved to reach the the more international partners. The new projects for attaining the fundamental purpose of the transparency and efficiency continue to come up. One might claim that the COVID-19 has fostered the development of new innovative solutions. To exemplify, the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan recently signed an order to establish an Assam appeal information system via this information system. Via this novel system, the citizens will be able to issue their complaints related to public utilities, roads and transport, as well as the current repairment, improvement, and renovation of the infrastructures. The location will be marked on an electronic map and sent to the relevant state agencies for review. Coming to the issue of the trust, it's evident that this concept is formulated with the help of the transparent, efficient, and effective institutions, as well as the sound information transformation system. Fortunately, these enumerated values and principles are ingrained in the work and activities of Assam service. All these timely and effective measures once again depict the reasons why Assam service has been awarded with the UN Public Service Award in 2015 with its high achievements in the field of public service delivery, and UN Special Award for promoting digital transformation in the public sector. And I also would like to mention that the United Nations Public Service Forum last year, organized by our agency jointly with the United Nations Development of Economic and Social Affairs in Baku last year in June. To finalize, I would like to once again to note that all these governance methods are designed to solely attain the transparency, efficiency, effectiveness, and trust in the Republic of Azerbaijan. At the end, I should note that we are happy to observe the positive feedback coming from the society, the citizen satisfaction. I extend my sincere gratitude to the distinguished audience for attention, and I firmly believe that the work of the panel, as well as the ideas shared by the respectable panelists, will put a spotlight into the research and activities in this particular sphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And now we have 15 minutes left. And so I would like to share with you some of the questions we have received from our participants. So I will start with Professor, with Dr. Farah. There were two questions for you. One is, in which category does China belong, and for which data, from which year are the data you used for that two-dimensional mapping?
So yes, so this question for me.
Yes, sir.
Yes, very good. I wasn't clear. So this data is coming from the, I'll start with the second part, the Global Labor Resilience Index, which is a composite index that we've been developing over the past 10 years.
Okay.
And it's done under the supervision of Christopher Pisaderes, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. So this is let's say a ground study which is published every year. So this is the data used. China is in effect in the supervised angle. So that means it's not the invisible hands; it's rather the managed economies. So a bit more stronger, I would say, in terms of push.
Thank you very much. We have a question for Dr. Leitner. Which countries are currently working on the Smart City program?
Well, I think there's plenty of countries working on it. I'm more familiar with the smart city initiatives within the European Union, where there's also coordination. But I know that this is a global trend, and I think there are leaders in different, indices. But I think it's an issue where we find plenty of examples if there is specific request from the person who has asked the question on what kind of lessons they want to learn, in which particular context they want to get in touch with. For example, City of Vienna has been ranked quite high, but it depends very much on the framework conditions. So very happy to provide context and information there.
Second question always for you is, as we know, developing countries have limited financial resources. What recommendations can you make for developing countries in increasing public sector capacity in these circumstances?
This is very, very good question. First of all, I think within the country, it is very important to focus on the priorities and what is really needed. To develop your own strategy and not sort of adopt an approach of one size fits all from other countries. There's plenty of solutions around that are even available for free. Like, for example, in the case of Estonia, they were offering their e-education platforms to any country who wanted to use it during the crisis. Of course, this needs, the connectivity and the infrastructure that I've been talking about. But here, this is also a call for international organizations and the richer countries. Do not stop, the aid at the moment, but build the digital into this capacity building into your development strategies. And I think there is awareness about that on a global scale. But we'll see how the financial constraints will impact on that.
Thank you very much. We have a question for Professor Nakrosis. The question is, what are the factors that help or hinder collaborative governance during implementation?
Thanks for your question. I think that motivation and capacities to engage in collaborative relations are the two key factors that affect collaborative governance during implementation. The phenomenon of rallying around the flag mobilizes governmental or non-governmental actors for action, and they are ready more than ever during the crisis situation to engage in problem solving with the government institutions. But appropriate structures and tools should be put in place by governmental institutions in order to engage with the different types of actors, like networks managing crises should extend beyond hierarchies to include the thematic and territorial groups. And of course, as I mentioned during my presentation, political leaders should exercise open and democratic style of leadership to enable the participation of different actors while coping with the negative effects of the crisis.
Thank you very much. I have one more question for Dr. Farra, and the question is, what difficulties might get in the way on the path from citizen empowerment path to citizen-centric societies in the region?
Well, I think there are two main challenges. The first one is the social contract. I know it's a very loose concept, but in effect, this has a real impact, especially when we talk about the large conglomerates within the entire region. But the second part is also the very concrete connecting the dot between policies. There are too many divisions between ministries, departments, and so on. Not enough whole of country, whole of government approach to the region.
And this is probably a question that I could ask to all of you. And one of our participants wonders, to what extent the low level of citizens' compliance with government regulations in the early stages of the COVID crisis was due to the fact that citizens in the country and in the region have little trust in the government, or less so than in Western countries?
Well, I guess that should be from the region answering.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the interesting presentation, Robert.
But otherwise, Professor, if no one else is jumping in, I'll probably give you just a very short answer on this. I don't think it's a question of a lack of trust in government. I think it's when you're left alone, the quantum unit at the end of any policy, if you go down to the foundation, is the people, is the person. So that is at the end, we civil servants, consultants, professors, and so on, We're all people. And I know it's a fundamental point, because when you reconstruct all public policies, at the end, it's about the learning curve that you have as an individual. So that's the broader answer on saying when everything goes out, at the end, you come back to the essential.
Thank you very much.
And I also would like to add to one important point, a very good question, if you don't mind. So I have the small remarks on it. So it's important to involve the citizen engagement to this process. Why drafting the law, even to drafting the public policies, it's very important to involve and to attract the interests of the citizens. And which in Azerbaijan, since 2012, we are just, how to say, forming up the systems, the special systems, and we are working on electronic systems in order to attract and to involve that special attentions of the citizens to drafting even the law, or cut down some bureaucratic or unnecessary documents. Because as a public service center, like a Sun Service Center, we have an idea bank, for example, that the citizens center their ideas. And through the help of the citizens, up to now, we received hundreds of the, proposals. And through the help of our citizens, the local citizens, not the civil servants, our civil service, our government, achieved to cut down, for example, the list of the documents. For example, for required of in a Sun Service Center, we have ID card services. And through the help of the ID of the services, we achieved to decrease, to cut down some of the papers. We got the proposals of the citizens. We prepared the proposal and offered to the government, to our parliament, and then based on the proposal of the citizens and based on our draft law, our government make a decision to cut down the issues. And also we achieved some, for example, we have the Assam payment. The electronic payment, for example, the fines, the traffic penalties can pay by the Assam payment terminals via online or the terminals, which was configured in all the supermarkets and in the, the air terminals. And this is also idea of the citizen of Azerbaijan. We, invest to our citizens and involve them and make a gift for their idea, brilliant idea, and we make a propaganda. This Assam payment terminal is the idea of this citizen. And this is somehow the interest and the way of attracting the citizens to improve, to further develop the public policy systems.
That's a very brilliant solution, very interesting. Thank you very much. There is a question from Professor Colin Knox for Dr. Badr in the chat, and I think that's the last question we can take. The question is, isn't communication a one-way flow of information and on the soft side of open government?
Yes, thank you. And maybe I'll also respond to the question right before that one, which was highlighted and also has a communication angle. Just to say that indeed, there is a strong digital divide in many countries. So communication cannot just be online using digital tools all the time. But we have seen in many countries examples of the successful use of text messages, where a very strong number of the population is has mobile phones. You can also make use of, governments can also make use of billboards, radio, but also working with local community leaders, for example. So this is also resonates with some of what the respondents have said in terms of engaging with stakeholders from outside the government. And on your question with regards to communication being a one-way flow of information, that's sort of the classical understanding that we have of communication. But from the OECD's definition, communication needs to be a two-way means of interacting and needs to be a strategic lever. And it's actually an essential component and a pillar of open government. And the OECD recommendation of the Council on Open Government, where we define what open government is, public communication is actually linked to 3 or 4 of the 10 provisions that exist in that legal instrument. So it's really an essential element of it. You cannot engage citizens, you cannot strengthen transparency only through one-way communication. It has to be used as a means to engage with participants, to give them the information that they need to be able to participate in public life, to be able to be more informed and empowered. If it's only putting information out there, we're not achieving the open government objectives that we have for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So before we close this session, I have a couple of announcements, actually 3. First of all, I was invited to share our gratitude to all the participants and to all the speakers for making a very, very interesting panel. We opened the day today with a speech of Professor Vinod Thomas, former Senior Vice President of the World Bank. He said, crisis is always an opportunity. One thing that we need to do is to focus on priority areas from education to health and so forth and so on. But key issue is we need to have public sector reform. This panel was brilliant because it provided a lot of food of thought on how public sector reforms can be made to make our governments work better, rebuild the citizen trust in government institution, how decentralization can feature into that. So I think this was a very, very interesting, and we as organizers are most grateful to the Astana Civil Service Hub for putting this panel together. We have been working for 4 years now in organizing this conference, and they always manage to come up with fantastic panels. So thanks to the Hub, thanks to you all. That's the first point. The second point, and I'm under very strict instruction here, I need to remind you that 5:30, go back to Pine. We're going to have the closing ceremony for day one. Please come there and join us. And point number 3, turn on your cameras because to close this session, we will have a picture all together. So turn on your camera and we're going to do it. Thank you very much.